đâu phải em mua Phật em nhìn cái vật em mới mua Phật đó. Đâu phải nhìn cái dạo.
Hi everyone, good day to everyone has joined us. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome all our participants who's joining us for our webinar on the art of improving outcomes in pre-hospital care. I'm Dr. Kalyani Rajendran, emergency physician from Hospital Putrajaya, and I'll be your moderator for today. A little bit on housekeeping before we start. If you could see, if you have any questions for the speaker, please kindly write down your questions in our Q&A box down there. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Khairul Nizam Hassan, our host today. He's a
Ở nhà của con nhưng mà con không lấy cắp con chỉ con rồi con biết con cua có đi đó có liền. Con thấy nó có ăn cái đó đó hả? Dạ. Chơi gì ta? Ông nội đâu? Đi ông nội. Ăn bánh.
Hello, good morning to everyone. I'm Dr. Jimmy Judd from Seoul Medical. I think we are experiencing some technical issues on the Dr. Kalyani's side. So I will begin the webinar to continue on with the introduction of Dr. Khairul Nizam, who is the consultant emergency physician and head of department for Hospital Putrajaya, Malaysia. And over to you, Dr. Khairul, for your opening speech.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the session. My name is Khairul. Allow me to greet you with Islamic greetings. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and very good morning. It's a great pleasure to see many faces on this forum. As June once hope you enjoy your time here as much as we enjoy having you over. I know that many of you have taken the time away from your packed schedule and
cái bài này là con mua bát nó sáng. Bà nội ơi, cầm cái bánh bao nó đón bạn nè. Bà nội ơi, miễn con bớt thầy.
hello.
Yes, Dr. Khairul, we can hear you.
Yes, Dr. Khairul, we can hear you.
Let me continue with some introduction about Malaysian pre-hospital care service system. System-wise, pre-hospital care services in Malaysia is a hospital-based system where emergency medical services personnel are trained and managed at the hospital level. Activity will be initiated through 999 emergency response system and medically controlled, coordinated by medical emergency coordinating center and incorporated into the existing hospital system seamlessly. This event is one that has been long anticipated by us. We, together with Zol, have worked at ensuring that you feel our warm welcome when the program started. It is our pleasure to have Dr. Daniel Davis as the speaker for this morning. We cannot think of a single person more qualified to address the current audience. We would like to, however, take this opportunity to tell him that it is our honor and privilege to welcome him here. So without further ado, Dr. Daniel Davis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I wish that I could be there in person, but obviously that's not going to happen, at least not this month. But I'm hoping that at some point in 2022, maybe I can actually come and visit in person and not just virtually. But for now, I'm very honored to be able to share with you some of the things that we've found that I think are very exciting with regard to resuscitation outcomes, and specifically to this group that has special interest in EMS. And so we're going to divide this lecture into two parts. The first part, I'm going to focus on some of the theories and some of the didactics. And then we'll spend the second part going through actual cases that I hope will inspire you to do something similar or to collaborate with us in learning how to do these techniques, because as I hope that you'll see, there's a lot of opportunity here to save many lives. Now, right now, I'm actually not in my normal home in California, but I'm in the mountains of a state called Montana, which means mountains in Spanish. And this is a view from the place that I'm sitting now, although right now it's dark. But because the internet connection is not particularly good here, I'm going to actually turn off my video so I can focus on my slides, and then I'll reactivate my video once we start the question and answer session. Now, where I practice clinically, you probably have seen before, especially if you are using a Mac computer, because the operating system Catalina is actually where I practice medicine on an island off the coast of Los Angeles, and our hospital is right there on your home screen for those of you who use this operating system. Okay, so for the first part of this lecture, what we'd like to accomplish is, number one, to introduce you to the current thinking, which we call the perfusion model of CPR, focusing on chest compressions, and then show you some of the common errors and examples that have been downloaded from defibrillators that record the actual performance of CPR. Then I'm going to offer you some strategies to improve CPR and demonstrate the outcomes that we've experienced, and then we'll stop and have some discussion and questions. Now, I will be sharing these slides with you, and you're going to see there's many different types of slides. Lots of the slides from the second half are case examples. And so I'll try and point out what I think represent the most important slides that you might use as a reference or as a guide for your own efforts. Okay, so let's start with the current model of CPR, which I call the perfusion model. That was born out of a model introduced by Lance Becker and Myron Weisfeld over 2 decades ago that they called the 3-phase model, which suggests that at least for ventricular fibrillation, which is the classic cardiac arrest, the first 4 minutes we call the electrical phase, and those are characterized by the opportunity to shock as soon as possible. And that has always been the traditional approach to resuscitation, at least until about 15 years ago, where everything focused on rapid access to a defibrillator, initially provided by less experienced personnel like EMTs and even policemen and firemen in different parts of the world. And if you're a high enough risk patient, you'll actually have a defibrillator placed in your chest to try and provide that initial shock within seconds rather than minutes. Now, after about 4 minutes, we enter a different phase called the circulatory phase. And that's where most of our patients are encountered, both in the field and in the hospital setting. And in this phase, rather than providing a shock immediately, we want to provide CPR. And that either that prepares the heart for defibrillation if they're in a shockable rhythm, or it encourages the heart to start again on its own if they're in a non-shockable rhythm. Now, we used to think that that phase only lasted until about 10 minutes, and that after 10 minutes, you entered what we call the metabolic phase, where not only is CPR less likely to be effective, but we may actually need to prepare the heart and the brain for reperfusion before return of circulation because the reperfusion itself does quite a bit of damage. As you're going to see on the next slide, that might extend much longer than just 10 minutes, that we may be able to extend the circulatory phase for up to 20 or more minutes with good CPR. And that brings up this model of cardiac arrest. Now, obviously, this is not a clinical model, this is an animal model. But I put this up here to demonstrate the difference between what we know experimentally and what we experience clinically. In the laboratory, we can remove a heart from an animal and leave it completely unperfused with no blood, no oxygen for over an hour. And as long as we reattach it and provide ample perfusion, that we can get the heart to restart almost 100% of the time. And yet that's very different from our clinical experience, where if nobody starts compressions in the field and it takes more than 10 minutes for EMS to arrive, the chance of survival is near zero. Now, is that because of differences between animals and humans? Probably not. It's more likely the difference between hooking up the heart to a tube full of sugar water and oxygen versus expecting that we can perfuse the heart with standard CPR. And what you see in this picture is a pig receiving external with a machine being performed with the perfect rate and the perfect depth and the perfect recoil. And in the background, which I've outlined in pink, you see the aortic pressure going up and down with the chest compressions and dropping fairly quickly for pauses, in this case, pauses for ventilation. But the key to understanding cardiac arrest is that red dashed line in the middle of the screen. That represents the pressure within the wall of the heart that must be exceeded before blood will flow into the heart muscle. It's easy to get the heart perfused when you attach it to a tube. It's very difficult to get the heart to perfuse with external chest compressions. As you see here, that only briefly do we have a period where blood is flowing into the heart, and then we're stopping, in this case, again, for ventilations. But as you'll see, we stop for lots of different things. And this is with perfect compressions being performed by machines. The reality is that human CPR is much less than perfect, and that in many cases, we can't even get the coronary perfusion pressure to reach that critical target. This is another animal model where even with external compressions being performed by machines, they weren't able to get the aortic pressure above that coronary perfusion pressure. So we really have a very difficult task when asked to perform chest compressions and expect that the aortic pressure will be high enough to perfuse the heart and get it to start beating again. But probably the biggest challenge is the fact that human CPR is much, much less than perfect. When we studied this in Los Angeles, we found that even within 3 or 4 months of their last training, paramedics were only performing about 2% of compressions that met AHA standards at that time. And hospital physicians and nurses were even worse. In the emergency department, in a simulation, 16 out of 19 emergency physicians and nurses couldn't even do a single compression that met American Heart Association standards. So when you combine that with the model that I showed you before, for most of our patients, the aortic pressure isn't coming anywhere near that critical threshold, and that explains why very few patients are successfully resuscitated with compressions. In fact, most of the survivors in EMS are patients in shockable rhythms who survive not because they received good compressions, but despite the fact that the compressions were suboptimal, they just happened to still be in the electrical phase when they could be successfully defibrillated. And if we're relying on chest compressions to successfully resuscitate patients, then in most cases, we're going to be disappointed. Now, what are the common CPR errors that we see? Well, the most common are the interruptions. Here you see, again, in a laboratory setting, with ideal 30-2 CPR performed by machines, that only about half the time is spent with compressions. And that parallels what we see in even the best EMS systems, which when they're performing 30-2 CPR perfectly, they still can only achieve about 50 or 60% compression fractions. That is the percentage of time that's spent doing chest compressions versus other things like ventilations, rhythm analysis, defibrillation, etc. And that the aortic pressure suffers as a result of these interruptions. Now, we made a list of all the things that interrupt CPR during resuscitation, and this is something that you could easily come up with on your own. And what we had to do was figure out how are we going to perform all of these tasks without interrupting compressions. In other words, if we assume that compressions have to be performed from the moment the patient arrests, or at least until we have contact with the patient, until we're certain that they have spontaneous perfusion, then how do we do all of these things? How do we analyze the rhythm? How do we ventilate? How can we perform defibrillation safely with minimal interruption in chest compressions? How can we determine that the patient has had return of circulation and confirm that with minimal interruption in chest compressions? And all the procedures like intubation, or in a hospital setting, the placement of central lines, switching compressors, and in EMS, moving the patient from the floor to some sort of a gurney, from the gurney to the ambulance, moving in an ambulance, and then transferring to the emergency department. All of these things have to be considered so that we can minimize the interruptions in CPR. But it is possible to do. In our hospital, the average chest compression fraction is 94%, which means that only 6% of the time are there not compressions being performed. And in some of our EMS agencies, they've actually exceeded 95% for several years in a row. And so it is possible to do, and you'll see their survival rates reflect the fact that they've been able to perform CPR continuously throughout resuscitation. Now, here's an example of a patient who has interruptions, particularly at a bad time in the resuscitation. So what we're looking at here is the software from Zoll that shows you from left to right the evolution of one particular case. So this is an actual case with the timestamps on the bottom there. And as we move through time, we're moving from left to right. At the very top, you see defibrillations. The second line, you see compression depth. The third line, you see compression rate. The fourth line is an overall prediction of which compressions are within the target that we're looking for. And on the bottom, you see the recoil or release velocity. And so you'll get very familiar with the screen. But in this particular case, I want you to appreciate on the in the kind of middle there, which I've outlined in red, you see 3 successive defibrillation attempts and almost no compression surrounding the defibrillations. So one of the biggest opportunities is to train people to do compressions right up until the moment of defibrillation, and then to resume compressions immediately after the defibrillation, rather than waiting to see or spending a lot of time analyzing the rhythm before each shock. That you want to sandwich each shock with compressions on both ends. And so that's one of the biggest opportunities. Now, another opportunity has to do with the actual mechanics of CPR. And I can tell you that most compressions that we see, especially if there is no guidance, if there is no feedback, or when the pads are first placed on the patient, reflecting what people have been doing for the last several minutes before they have access to feedback. Almost all the compressions are too fast, and there's very poor recoil, which the way that the machine measures compression depth, it's actually an amplitude from the bottom to the top of a compression. And these compressions where there's a lot of leaning or very poor recoil are measured as too shallow, but not because they're not pushing the sternum down enough. It's that they're not allowing the sternum to come back up enough. And that's measured as a shallow compression depth. So you see that here, particularly with that first compressor where the rate is about 150 compressions a minute. And if you look on the bottom, the recoil is very poor, and it translates to a very shallow compression depth, only about 1.5 inches or about 4 centimeters. Now, one of the most important things that a resuscitation leader needs to learn is to recognize what fatigue looks like. What you're seeing on the screen are actual physicians that are participating in a workshop, doing about 1 minute or 60 seconds of CPR on a mannequin, knowing that we're recording their rate and their depth. But what you see in almost every single situation is a downward angle in the depth, going from deep to not as deep. That, if we had the recoil velocity displayed as well, would also be accompanied by a decrease in recoil velocity or release velocity. And that's what fatigue looks like. And so what you should appreciate is that fatigue happens even within the first 60 seconds. And that it's something that a code leader, a resuscitation leader, has to be alert for. The days where you would let the compressor go for 3 or 4 minutes until he or she said, "I'm tired, I need to switch," are gone. And in fact, in most of the agencies with whom we work, we suggest maybe they should switch every minute. And even then, as you see here, the team leader has to be alert for the signs of compression fatigue. And if I go to the next block here, which is an actual case, you see the same sort of patterns, especially there on the right. In this particular case, the patient had a temporary return of circulation, and then they resumed CPR again on the right side of the screen. And you see that even though the total amount of CPR was less than 10 minutes, that already the compressors are fatigued, they're tired. And you can tell that by the decrease in compression depth. And in this case, it's flipped upside down, so a deeper compression goes down more, and then as it gets shallower, it goes upward. And that's accompanied by a decrease in recoil velocity. Essentially, people start to lean on the chest as they get tired. And that's something that's easy to pick up if you get the right training as a code leader, because you'll see the depth start to drop. Also notice how consistent the compressions are from compression to compression. That although you might think that the compression depth would vary from 2 inches to 2.5 inches to 1.7 inches to 2.6 inches to 2.2, that the reality is that they're actually very consistent. Each one of those little lines represents a compression. And for the most part, the one compression is very similar to the one that preceded it and the one immediately after it, which means that you will be able to detect these subtle signs of fatigue. And again, that's one of the most important things that we teach to our team leaders. Now, here's a little more subtle example in the case that I showed you before, that demonstrated the pauses for defibrillation attempts. But this also demonstrated a very subtle fatigue pattern where in this particular patient and in this particular compressor, they started out at about 3 inches or 7 or 8 centimeters. And over the course of 2 minutes, almost 2.5 minutes, as a matter of fact, you see that the recoil velocity went from blue, which is very good, high velocity, nice recoil of the chest, down to brown and even into the white zone where the compressor is leaning on the chest. And that's accompanied by a decrease in the depth from about 3 inches to only about 2 inches. And again, each compression is fairly similar to the one before and the one after. So this is not hard to pick up during actual resuscitation. So how do we address these things? How do we improve them through training and through feedback? We're going to spend the second half talking quite a bit about the feedback itself, but I'm going to give you my guide as to how we were able to improve the performance of CPR in our hospitals, in our EMS systems, and even in our helicopters. And it basically falls into a couple of strategies. The first one is designed to motivate the providers. We are in an era where people are very cynical and very pessimistic about cardiac arrest, and for good reason. We've seen that arrest survival rates really haven't improved that much across the United States and across the world over the last 1 to 2 decades. In fact, in most studies, survival rates were higher in the early 1990s than they are today, which may reflect a different patient population, but certainly doesn't reflect the renewed emphasis on performing CPR quality. And a lot of that has to do with people being skeptical. They don't believe that any of this is going to make a difference. They're used to the ILCOR guidelines or American Heart Association every 5 years saying, this is how you should do it, and this is different than it was 5 years earlier. And so they tend to default to the way they started earlier in their careers when, in many cases, they saw more survival than they do currently. So how do you motivate these folks? Well, the first thing I try to do is inspire them by using stories, either personal stories or even having them reflect on patients or even family members who have had cardiac arrest, but showing them what's possible and how many people we could save who we can't currently save. That brings up the problem, and I always try and focus the problem back on the fact that we're not doing quality compressions, like I've already showed you. I use science to establish the conceptual framework. Even with less sophisticated rescuers than you guys, I use a lot of the same slides that I just showed you, which are fairly sophisticated, talking about coronary perfusion pressure and myocardial wall pressure, to try to convince folks that there is a framework, there is justification for everything that we're talking about. But that means that we have to give them tools for success. Because if all that you leave them with is sophisticated science, and you tell them that now in 10 minutes they have to be able to perform highest quality CPR for each individual patient, the chance that they can succeed is very low. And that means that we have to simplify into these algorithms that I'll show you. And that, again, if you want access to these slides, you'll be able to see the algorithms for yourself that are so simple, you can't help but follow them effectively, even in the stress of a cardiac arrest, and even if you only do this once or twice a year. One of the most important pieces is to integrate the technology, and I'll show you more about that in a second. But we haven't done a particularly good job of bringing the new technology into resuscitation training. And much of that has to do with the American Heart Association, to their credit, trying to not be brand specific, to be agnostic or neutral when it comes to certain technology platforms. It also has to do with budgets, and it's very difficult to get your hospital or your EMS system to buy a defibrillator just to use in training. And so oftentimes the training programs have older defibrillators that don't have all the same technology as the ones that will be used in clinical practice. And we're in an era where technology really defines the way that resuscitation should be performed. For the first time in history, we have to have the same technology for training that we use in actual clinical practice. Providing feedback is what we'll spend a lot of time on in the second part of this webinar. So I'm not going to go deep into that. And I also want to offer you up what I call a leadership model, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. So, like I just mentioned, for the first time in history, we're seeing technology driving the resuscitation algorithms. And a good example you can see on the screen there, where on the top line of the rhythm, you see an unfiltered electrocardiogram, which shows the traditional compression artifact. And in the center, you see a filtered electrocardiogram, which shows you very clearly that you're dealing with a shockable rhythm. So right off the bat, if you know the rhythm without having to stop compressions, then you shouldn't really stop every 2 minutes to check the rhythm. You already know it. And it doesn't make sense if the overall goal is to minimize interruptions. But yet the guidelines and all of the training say that we should interrupt CPR every 2 minutes to check the rhythm. because they're assuming we don't have this technology. So certainly if you have this, you shouldn't stop every 2 minutes, but then it begs the question, well, then when should you stop? When should you stop compressions? And you're going to see how we've handled that in the algorithm. The other challenge with the new technology has to do with the sophistication, which I'll come back to. Now, if you teach to the technology, if you integrate it into the training and you give people very simple algorithms that allow them to use the technology effectively, you can certainly achieve the initial goal of high quality CPR. In that same study in Los Angeles, you see that once we taught them how to use the technology that they already had, so we didn't even introduce the technology, we just showed them how to use it and inspired them to want to do good compressions. Then suddenly they're doing good CPR 80 to 90% of the time. And those same physicians and nurses from the emergency department who couldn't even manage one single compression now have most of their compressions, 90 to 100%, within the right targets. We did a study, at least in the simulation laboratory, looking at physicians and nurses, and found that at baseline, it was very difficult to hit the current guidelines of 5 to 6 centimeters or 2 to 2.5 inches at a rate of 100 to 120. That many compressions were too shallow or too deep, many compressions were too slow or too fast. But that once you taught them how to use the technology and the feedback, then almost every compression fell into both of those target ranges. Now, one of the most interesting things, I hope, is the idea that we're now going to try and push you from standard CPR parameters, 5 to 6 centimeters, 100 to 120 compressions per minute, into the idea that each individual patient needs his or her unique blend of rate, depth, and chest recoil, and perhaps even things like where to put the hands on the chest. This is now part of the guidelines that were released in 2020, although they didn't get much attention, probably because we were all distracted by COVID. But in these guidelines, it said, if you have access to end-tidal CO2 or an arterial catheter, which is less realistic in the EMS environment, but if you have access to end-tidal CO2, it's reasonable to modify your compression targets to try and maximize the end-tidal CO2. This comes out of animal studies, which I won't go into great detail, but essentially said, if standard CPR isn't achieving an end-tidal CO2 value, and in this study, they targeted 25 millimeters of mercury or higher, and you allowed the rescuers to modify the CPR, the rate, the depth, and the position on the chest to try and drive the CO2 back up, the survival rate was much higher. In this study, 82%, as opposed to if standard CPR wasn't effective at maintaining optimal CO2, but you had to stay with the standard guidelines, in which case none of the animals survived. This has now been tested, at least in pediatric human models, and you see exactly the same thing. No matter what parameter you measure, it's better if you have end-tidal CO2 as your target. And if you look in the center of the screen, in this relatively small study in pediatric arrest victims, the survival in those in whom end-tidal CO2 was used as a target was 50%, as opposed to only 14% for those who just stuck with standard CPR. That approach is essentially what I'm going to advocate to you as what you should be teaching in your hospitals and in your EMS systems, that you should be using end-tidal CO2, particularly in EMS, as a target, and that whatever has to be done to try to keep the CO2 elevated, at least above 25, but in some cases it starts out in the 30s or 40s, to try to keep it moving upward, that's going to give you your best chance of survival. But that comes with a challenge, because at any given moment on a Zoll defibrillator, you may have any or all of these parameters being displayed. And if you only participate in cardiac arrest once every 2 or 3 or 6 months, the chances that you're going to understand all of these things and be able to utilize them effectively is very low unless you change your training. And so that brings up my last point before we stop for questions, and that is that I would suggest to you that your model for resuscitation, both in and out of the hospital, should really be more like this, where you have one individual who's looking in the direction that you're moving and is giving commands to everyone else. And what that means for us in resuscitation is that you have to have individuals who understand the technology, are being trained in irregular time intervals to understand the technology and to practice, so that when there's an actual resuscitation, they can tell the others exactly what they need them to do. And that may mean that they are needing to adhere to the standard guidelines first, then detect when they're getting tired so they can switch compressors, but finally to try different blends of rate and depth and recoil and hand position until the end-tidal CO2 starts to go up, knowing that that's providing the best cardiac output and the best chance of survival. So how do you do that? Well, that's where I'm going to offer you the algorithm that we use, which isn't really even an algorithm. It really is just a concept that a patient in cardiac arrest goes to CPR Island. And on CPR Island, you do perfect compressions. There's only 2 reasons that you would leave CPR Island, and both of them are identifiable by your defibrillator: a shockable rhythm or a perfusing rhythm. How do you know that a rhythm's shockable? Well, if you have the see-through CPR, the filter, you'll probably be able to pick it up without even having to stop compressions. But otherwise, if you think you see a shockable rhythm, and you can try this for yourself, it only takes about 2 seconds of a pause. That could be just the time it takes to switch compressors. If you're looking at the screen during those 2 seconds, you'll see whether the deflections that you're looking at represent a shockable rhythm or if it represents a CPR artifact. And we use end-tidal CO2 in these decisions as well. If you see an increase in the heart rate, which is really easy to see with the CPR filter software, accompanied by a rise in end-tidal CO2, that predicts that there's been return of circulation. And again, you can confirm that if you get somebody with their hands on the femoral artery and you have the ventilator continue to ventilate to look for a sudden drop in CO2 when you stop compressions that says the patient isn't back in spontaneous perfusion. But you can reduce the perfusion check to about 5 seconds, which we've been able to document. And so the basic algorithm is do CPR when the patient's in cardiac arrest and use your monitor to identify the 2 reasons that you would leave CPR Island: a shockable rhythm or a perfusing rhythm. And remember, as soon as you shock the patient, you return to CPR Island and start looking for that perfusing rhythm and then the rise in end-tidal CO2. When we bring a hospital or an EMS agency on board, we'll give them a more sophisticated algorithm that reflects their unique equipment, the shock sequence that goes along with that, and even their decisions about things like epinephrine and vasopressin. But for training, we go back to the very simple algorithm so that everybody understands the concept of CPR Island, and that even the way that we train to use the defibrillators. There are hundreds of these screenshots, and we'll flash this on the screen to say, is there a reason to leave CPR Island? That's the only question that you have to answer. In this case, we don't have a shockable rhythm and we don't have a perfusing rhythm with a nice high end-tidal CO2. So we go back to making sure we have perfect CPR. And in this case, you can tell from the parameters at the top, this is far from perfect, that we need to slow down, do better chest recoil, and look to see if the depth comes up appropriately. So we play these games, we rehearse this at meetings, we periodically expose people to this training so that they can always be current on exactly how they achieve the goal of maintaining perfect CPR and avoiding interruptions throughout the resuscitation. And that's really where we get the dramatic improvement in outcomes. And so here we get to brag a little bit, but whether you're talking about hospitals on the far left, emergency departments in the middle, helicopters just to the right of the middle, or ground EMS systems, the change in cardiac arrest survival is dramatic and immediate in every single situation. And we could double the number of participants from this graph here now, that whatever their baseline was, it will double or triple, or in some cases even quadruple or quintuple after a single round of training, teaching people why the CPR is so important and helping them understand how to achieve that with whatever equipment they currently have. Even if all they have is an old-fashioned defibrillator, then we have to use more clinical clues to define what perfect CPR looks like. But certainly when you get better equipment that gives you the real-time feedback, then you're even better able to achieve those goals. When we train for adults, we even see that pediatric arrests improve. In our system in Southern California, even though the training wasn't specified towards pediatrics, we saw their survival go up threefold, from 9% to 27%, and be sustained for more than a year and a half till we were done with this study. And if you compare our EMS agencies that have piloted this approach to the published literature, which is often from agencies that have good outcomes and participated in research, you can see that we, on the average, double and in some cases even triple the survival that we see in other places. And the same is true in hospitals, because I suspect most of you, even if you're involved in EMS, also work in the hospital setting, where again, we see survival rates that double and triple that of the published literature. So this is not hard to do, but it takes a change in your approach that emphasizes the importance of perfect compressions, the individualization of CPR, and the integration of technology. And I'm going to stop there. I'm going to turn my camera back on, and then we'll take any questions that you have before we move into the actual cases.
Yes, Dr. Daniel. It's very impressive to see the data post-art, which is especially in the pre-hospital care level, which is very, very impressive, the outcomes. We have two questions here. One is from Wanwan Ramdhani. The question is how to judge into compression, whether to use an application or other tool to assess the details.
So I think that's probably the most important question of the day, and it's important for all of you who don't yet have this technology, wondering if this is something you have to wait until you do in order to participate. And the answer is definitely not. What we saw was that with just the training in teaching people clinical skills to assess compression quality, then the survival rates would double. But once we then integrate the technology and allow us that, what that allows us to do is individualize the CPR. That allows us to say that somebody like me, who's taller and has a larger chest, probably needs deeper compressions than 6 centimeters. Let's try 7 or 8 centimeters and watch the end tidal CO2 and see if that's true. That's where we see the survival tend to triple, or for EMS, it goes up into the 20+% range, which is as good as anywhere in the world, or in the hospital above 40% range, that it takes that integration of the technology. But even without that, just with our clinical skills, we can double the current survival rate. We can easily get your survival rate into the mid-teens for EMS and into the mid-30s for hospitals.
Okay, thank you. There is a second question. The question goes, would you recommend mechanical CPR in EMS or pre-hospital environment? And the same person has a second question. What is your policy on resuscitation on field? Stay till able to achieve ROSC or to bring to ED with ongoing CPR?
So these are all excellent questions people are asking. I personally, and we have a study ongoing that proves that I'm at least half right, I believe that with end-tidal CO2 and CPR feedback, that humans can outperform mechanical devices. Now, what we actually have found is that humans, if they've been doing compressions for less than about 15 or 20 minutes and have access to CPR feedback and end-tidal CO2, can outperform the machines. Once you get to about 20 minutes in general, at that point, at least in EMS, the team is so fatigued that ask our providers to do is collect CO2 data before they switch to the machine. And if the end-tidal CO2 drops upon the initiation of mechanical CPR, they go back to manual compressions because they've proven that that was doing better. Now, with regard to staying in the field, we definitely prefer that they stay on scene. Now, there are some things happening in the United States that are challenging that, one of which is the development of ECMO in emergency departments. And in some cases, ECMO is even being discussed about going into the field, where in certain parts of Asia, you're way ahead of us, and already you have mobile ECMO units. But the first folks to use ECMO in resuscitation are generally emergency departments, and they're suggesting that we shouldn't stay in the field too long if you have a patient that you think would benefit. And that's the challenge that we're having, is defining who benefits. We know that a witnessed arrest who received immediate CPR and ideally is in a shockable rhythm benefits from early ECMO and probably early percutaneous interventions, a trip to the cath lab. But once you go outside of that, once you go to unwitnessed arrests, once you don't have bystander CPR, once you start including non-shockable rhythms, the benefits of ECMO fall away very quickly. So we're struggling to define the groups that we think would benefit. But without ECMO, we have much better survival if they stay in the field, because the CPR quality deteriorates en route. And that is one of the indications to use a mechanical device, is if you're transporting for some reason, then the CPR should be done with a machine, because it's so hard to do in a moving ambulance, manual CPR.
Yeah, and that brings it to our last question, which goes, how about using mechanical compressors like autopulse to avoid interruptions?
Yeah, so that is definitely the good thing about the auto pulse. And in fact, we tell, or any of the mechanical devices, and we tell people who are still doing manual compressions, pretend like you're a mechanical device and that you're just going to do compressions and everyone else has to work around you. So the idea that you can do continuous compressions with a machine is very appealing. Now, sometimes the machine will be set to do 30 to 2, and in a separate discussion we could talk about, or if we have time at the end, we can talk about 30 to 2 versus continuous CPR, because we actually advocate continuous compressions with a ventilation on the upstroke of every 10th compression. And so whether you're doing mechanical or manual CPR, but like I said, the study that we're doing right now suggests that if you train people correctly and you give them end-tidal CO2 and CPR feedback, for the first 20 minutes, the manual CPR outperforms the mechanical device. And after 20 minutes, when the team starts to get tired, is when we see the mechanical device start to outperform manual CPR.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel. That would be our last question for our first session. I think we
Let
can
me take
go
on
to
that very last question there, because it's a good one. And I know
Yeah,
we're
all
pressed
right.
for time, but I'll catch us up. Don't worry, because this is whoever Sri Rao Siva is asking the future. That's the future of resuscitation right there. What they're, I don't know if everyone can see the question, but what they're asking is, you know, what about using mechanical CPR in the less sophisticated environment, and then allowing the more sophisticated providers in the emergency department then go to manual compressions? And what I predict we're going to see, and I won't say which groups are working on this, but essentially everyone is, including all the big manufacturers. the idea that the machines will be configurable, that you'll be able to set the rate, the depth, and even the chest recoil, not necessarily the speed, but whether you go back to neutral or even go past neutral, those machines already exist. And so we're working on protocols that would allow you to use a machine to adjust the CPR parameters. That, I think, will usher in the era where the machine will, fortunately or unfortunately, outperform manual compressions because the machine will be adjustable. The other piece that nobody asked about yet, but I suspect a couple of you might be thinking about, is the idea that elevated torso CPR, keeping the head elevated, seems to promote cerebral perfusion, but is very difficult to do with manual CPR. And so I think the other force that's going to usher in machine CPR is the idea that we'll be elevating the torso of a patient in cardiac arrest to about 45 degrees to promote cerebral perfusion. And although that sounds counterintuitive, the drop in intracranial pressure from draining out the venous blood when you elevate the head more than offsets the difficulty of pushing blood uphill, at least to about 45 degrees. And it's very difficult to do with manual compressions. So I think we're going to get to very quickly configurable machines and torso elevated CPR, but the machines will be guided by end-tidal CO2. So are we ready for round two?
Yes, I think we are.
Okay.
We can continue. Thank you very much for answering these questions, Doctor.
I'm turning myself off here and I'm going to share the screen. So this part I think is a lot of fun and hopefully you'll enjoy this. Hopefully you enjoyed the first part too, but it's always fun to look at cases, but using some of the principles that we've just talked about. And so very quickly, I'll try and convince you that this is a good thing to do and answer the question, why should we review cases? Give you a systematic approach to reviewing cases, and then go through a number of examples, and then again we'll have time for questions. And I've got probably more cases than we have time for. This is something that I think I'd like to push to have a more regular opportunity to review cases, because I think it's such a good learning experience. And that if I had to pick one thing that I did in my EMS system that changed the culture of resuscitation towards a chest compression oriented approach, it's exactly what I'm going to show you now. So that probably answers the best why we should be reviewing cases. And I am an EMS medical director. I've been an EMS medical director for both ground and for air. And I understand that you don't have a lot of time. And so you have to decide what are the most important things for you to spend your time doing. And I'll offer to you, this is probably one of the most important. And the advantage now during the pandemic is that it can be done remotely, just like I'm going to do here. It does identify the opportunities for training. So if you consistently have compressions that are too fast and too shallow with poor recoil, you know exactly what to train on. It provides feedback, but also what we call a Hawthorne effect, meaning that if your agencies know what they're being evaluated on, what you're looking at as a medical director, they tend to want to please you. They tend to want to impress you, or at least they don't want to get into trouble. And so if they know that you don't really care that much how often they gave epinephrine, but you definitely care about the depth of compressions and the rate of compressions, they're more likely to focus on that during their resuscitation. But the piece that I'm most excited about is the idea that this is how we can train people to recognize patterns during actual cardiac arrest. We didn't know if this would be true, if looking at something in 2 dimensions on a piece of paper that represent time on the x-axis, if they would then be able to put that into practice and then look at things that are happening in real time and recognize a pattern without seeing the trend. And the answer seems to be yes, they can, but we're also working with Zoll specifically to try and improve the way that we display information so that the resuscitation leader can go back and look at the pattern during the arrest if they're curious, something like what the end-tidal CO2 has been doing or what the pattern with regard to compression depth or rate is. But ultimately, it's exactly what I said. It creates this culture or a cult of CPR where everyone realizes that that is the pathway to good outcomes. Now, here are some slides that if you needed to pull some out to help guide your efforts, these would be the ones. And the way that I approach these cases, because it can be a little bit overwhelming, especially if this is the first time you're seeing them. The first thing I try to do is tell the story, get the big picture of what the case was about, and then identify general trends in CPR, things that you can see without having to measure anything, without having to isolate individual compressors. But what I spend most of the time doing is identifying what I call compression epics, and you'll understand that better. It essentially boils down to one person's time doing CPR. So it could be anywhere from 30 seconds, usually around a minute or 2 minutes, but it's one person doing CPR, and we call that an epic of CPR. And that allows you to identify the errors and give that feedback to individuals or to the person leading the resuscitation so they understand what they should have been focused on more. And with regard to the feedback, I always try to provide some positive feedback and identify opportunities for improvement. That's just good performance improvement, that you don't want to give the impression that you're constantly insulting them or criticizing, but that you identify the good and the bad. And for the most part, they welcome the feedback and they want to see how they can do better, because if they believe that this is the pathway to good outcomes, then they want to give their patients the best CPR possible. So what is involved in the big picture? Well, we're looking at things like the duration. Right now, because people are skeptical, they oftentimes will do CPR for 15 minutes and then be done. And so I want to make sure that they didn't go too short. Or in some cases, that it was clear that the patient wasn't responding, but that they went for 30 or 45 minutes or even an hour, and that it was essentially futile. For EMS in particular, I try and identify when they were working on the scene versus them trying to do CPR en route. And then I want to identify the general type of arrest. Did it involve shocks? And was there a return of spontaneous circulation? And then start to look at the trends. Were there a lot of pauses? Was their overall issue CPR depth, rate, or chest recoil? With regard to the individual epics or those individual turns in CPR, what I first do for the entire performance of the case is try and identify the optimal depth. Now, this may be different than the standard guidelines, either because the patient was larger or smaller, or in some cases because compressions was being performed on a surface that wasn't a hard surface. In the hospital, that's the standard. In most hospital patients, they remain on a mattress. Even when they place a backboard, at least 1 to 2 centimeters of the compression depth is actual recoil of the mattress, not of the chest. And so that needs to be factored in when you're looking at cases. And then once I identify that optimal depth where the recoil is good and the rate is within the right range, then all of the other compressions are compared to those perfect compressions. We look for patterns like too fast, too shallow with leaning, sometimes too slow with leaning, the fatigue pattern that I showed you. And I'm going to show you examples of all of these, so don't worry about it. And again, you'll have this as a reference. And then I look for pauses, either for rhythm analysis around the time of defibrillation or during procedures like intubation. And if possible, and we try and put CO2, end-tidal CO2 adapters in place from the very beginning, even with bag valve mask, we try and point out where good compressions led to a rise in CO2 or bad compressions led to a drop in CO2. And again, I'll show you examples of all of this. So take a look at this case. And you see, this is the one I showed you before. We see that the first compressions, the first compressor who was there for at least 2.5 minutes and may even have been doing compressions when the pads were first placed, So this person may have been on the chest for a long time. But like almost every resuscitation that I see, the initial compressions are too too shallow due to poor recoil. You see the depth up there is only about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, or about maybe 3 or 4 centimeters. And the recoil is very poor. Now, if that's all we saw, they might try to say, well, this was a smaller patient, or it was an old woman who had a very stiff chest, or there were ribs that were broken and they couldn't do recoil. But if you look just to the right of the box that I outlined, you see that good recoil was possible. And when good recoil was present, we are able to define right here an optimal depth, in this case about 2.5 inches. And so 2.5 inches with good recoil was possible. And notice that the rate during that brief period of compressions was right where it should be, around 110 or 100 compressions a minute or so. Now also notice in this second compressor, or the second epoch, that we see that classic fatigue pattern where the recoil started out very good and started to drop away, and that manifests as a decrease in the chest compression depth. Now, if you didn't have this feedback, the way that you could identify that is that their hand would not be lifting off the chest. And that brings up something that we won't have time for today, but we actually asked our compressors to keep both hands open with the fingertips in contact with the chest, and the strong part of the hand, the ball of the hand, lifting up and down like an oil pump, where that portion of the hand actually leaves the chest to allow for maximum recoil, and then comes down without thumping the chest, not like a precordial thump, but it allows for optimal depth, optimal recoil, and it actually is a little bit longer, the duty cycle, and so it tends to keep the rates around the right rate better than if they're keeping their hands in contact with the chest. And here you see the drop in the recoil and the decrease in the compression depth. Okay, so here's a different case. Notice at the beginning of this case here, we have the typical leaning CPR. In this case, they were going much too fast, almost 160 compressions a minute. And that leaning or poor recoil CPR manifests as a low depth, not because they're not pushing down enough, but because they're not allowing the chest to recoil. The optimal depth seemed to be right about here, where we have the best chest recoil, about halfway through the case, which the total amount in this case was about 45 minutes or so. So this is a longer case. Now, the compressions in this particular case were mostly being performed by a machine. So why the compression recoil got better in the middle there is not exactly clear, but just for the purposes of what the optimal depth was in this particular case, the way I would define it would be at the point of maximum recoil, and there we see that the depth was about 3 inches instead of 2 to 2.5. You also see these pauses every couple of minutes or so, and these are pauses for rhythm analysis. Now, in this case, they had this gold platform, so they should have been able to see the rhythm without stopping compressions, but maybe they needed to confirm. But I can tell you that these pauses are quite a bit longer than they should be, about 15 to 20, in some cases even out to 30 seconds, or over there on the right, the pauses for even longer than a minute. That is much too long, and that when we start looking at end-tidal CO2, you'll see that a lot of the momentum you gain is lost with these long compression pauses. So this is one where the feedback would be to watch those initial compressions, because they're leaning on the chest and they're going much too fast, and try to avoid the long pauses. Try to read the rhythm without having to stop compressions. Part of the way that we do that is that simplified CPR island, where you're only looking for either shockable rhythm or a perfusing rhythm. It doesn't matter if the perfusing rhythm is idioventricular, or if it's SVT, or if it's even VTAC. If it's something organized faster than 40 beats a minute and is associated with a rise in end-tidal CO2, then we say it's possibly perfusing, let's check and see if that's the case. Here's another case. So again, we see at the beginning the compressions that have leaning, very poor recoil, much too fast, 140 to 150 a minute, and that manifests as very low depth. Again, not because they're not pushing down enough, they're not allowing the chest to recoil. But in this case, the patient got pulses about halfway through and then rearrested. And so even though the leader did a good job of getting the compressors to do good CPR, after only about a minute or so, and for the rest of that first half, they have a good rate, they have pretty consistent depth, and they have generally pretty good recoil. But after 2 or 3 minutes, when the patient rearrests, again, the first compressor goes back to their old habits. And this is very telling, this is very typical, that people default to leaning on the chest, going too fast, and that results in shallow appearing compressions. And so, unfortunately, people haven't gotten used to perfect CPR yet, and they typically will default to this sort of CPR. But in this case, it only took about 30 seconds to get the compressors back in line. So the leader did a good job in this case in steering the compressions back. Now this is an interesting one because we see, this is an EMS case, we see two compressors. One who starts out with very poor recoil, but then gives way to somebody who had better recoil. And then when that person gets back on the chest, they still are not doing great recoil, certainly better than their first time on the chest. And then each subsequent time on the chest, you can tell you're looking at the compressor who's leaning. And then toward the end, they're even getting tired again. Now they're really leaning on the chest, and now they're back to where they started. Very, very poor chest recoil. The other compressor does a very good job, where they have good recoil. You can see at the top, the depth is greater. And each time they get on the chest, you see good recoil, although by the end, they're starting to get tired too. This really only reflects about 20 minutes of CPR, but remember, that's about the point where the mechanical device starts to outperform the humans. And so it doesn't take long for us to get tired. Even young firemen in their mid-20s who work out every day get tired after only 20 minutes collectively of CPR. Now where it really gets interesting is when we start to put this into the context of end-tidal CO2, which you'll see at the very bottom, and I'll point this out. So what we see first here is a long pause as they try to sort out who's going to do CPR, what's the rhythm, and nobody's doing compressions. And so we actually see the end-tidal CO2 falling at the beginning. And then somebody starts compressions and it goes up, but then somebody else gets on and they're doing very poor quality CPR with lots of leaning, and the end-tidal CO2 falls again. And each time that we see either a pause or a period of leaning or poor recoil CPR, we can see the fall in the end-tidal CO2. It's easy to see. And way over here on the right, you see another interesting thing. This patient is actually loaded onto a gurney at this point, and they're traveling to the hospital. And you see the compressions become much more irregular. They're generally deeper because now the patient is on a mattress, even though they're also on a backboard. But because they're in a moving ambulance, you see some compressions that are deeper than they are on the left and some that are shallower. That takes on this very characteristic appearance of irregularity, reflecting that it's very difficult to do CPR in that moving ambulance. And you see that the CO2 starts to flatten out and even fall by the end of the case. Now here's another example where the leader was able to get the compressors to do better CPR fairly quickly. They started out actually too slow, which is a little bit unusual, but some people are trying to be so careful that they end up going too slow. And so in this case, the leader was able to speed them up, but it came at the expense of a drop in the chest recoil. So maybe this was a bigger patient with a larger chest where slower compressions were necessary to get good chest recoil. Now, initially there is at least a rise in the end-tidal CO2, but if the leader told the initial compressor, go faster, go faster, go faster, well, the later compressors took that to an extreme, and by the end of the case, they're up at 140 compressions a minute, and that this was not a good case, this was not a good outcome, even though initially the leader was able to get the compressor to speed up. And in fact, the chest recoil seemed to suffer a little bit as a result of the faster compressions, and so maybe they should have allowed them to slow down to see if that allowed the CO2 to recover. In this case, we see overall quite a bit of leaning in the chest. We see quite a few periods, and it seems to be one particular compressor again, where the compression recoil is poor. And in general, that's associated with drops or low values for end-tidal CO2. And so I try to point this out to reinforce all of these concepts, and we'll see what the actual feedback looks like in a second. But I try and circle things and show them, this is what I'm talking about. When you lean on the chest, the end-tidal CO2, which is our best surrogate for cardiac output, goes down. And that makes it harder to resuscitate your patient. So make sure you're not leaning on the chest. And if you don't have that recoil indicator, then you can use the chest compression depth. And if you don't have either of those, then you look for that liftoff, which I showed you. And if it's something you're interested in, then certainly contact me or contact the organizers, and we can schedule a different lecture to talk about the actual performance of CPR. In this case, when we see better CPR with better recoil, we see the end-tidal CO2 come up. Now here we have an entire case performed with the auto pulse. You don't see any manual compressions, whether they did any or whether they did it when they didn't have the machine hooked up. But you see very consistent CPR throughout, very few interruptions, a couple just to check the rhythm, but they're fairly brief. But you see the end-tidal CO2 initially going up, looking like the patient's going to respond. And then after about 15 minutes, it starts to drop again. And that's a very important pattern, because we don't want every patient to receive 45 minutes or 60 minutes of compressions, although sometimes it might be necessary. But we want to use the overall CO2 trends, and that if the CO2 is trending upward, that's a good sign that the patient is responding. But when it starts to trend downward, if you can't explain it with a change in the quality of CPR, then that indicates the patient's no longer responding, and you may be looking at an issue of futility. Now this is the same or similar to the case I showed you before, where the initial CPR starts out too slow and then eventually starts to pick up. But this is actually what was sent to the crews that participated in the case. I do this with an art pad. It costs about $80, and it comes with an electronic pen where I can actually see the case on the screen, and I can make circles and arrows and write words in different colors to make those points. And that makes it quite a bit faster, where I only need to spend 5 or at the most 10 minutes per case. And if in a hospital setting we have 200 arrests a year, you're talking about an hour a week. In EMS, in a medium to large size agency, you may have a couple thousand arrests a year, which would translate into anywhere up to 5 or 6 or more arrests per day. And so you're talking about an hour or so a day spent doing CPR feedback. And again, if you have to allocate time, this is one of the most time efficient things that you can do. In many ways, more efficient than having you participate directly in the training. But what we'd like to do is get the computer to do some of this for us, because I believe that that's probably feasible. Here's another case where you see I've circled the initial CPR again with leaning and a little bit on the slow side, but that's often a deliberate compressor who's trying too hard to do perfect CPR, but they're not allowing the chest to recoil. And that's measured as compressions that are a little bit shallower, but certainly with poor recoil. You see with the green, I've tried to outline what I think are the optimal compressions, where we see the best recoil right there in the middle. The depth was about 3 inches in this particular case. I guess I said 2.5 inches up at the top there. And then toward the end of the case, I identified another example of leaning, where the recoil was poor, the depth was low. And in this case, they didn't put the end tidal CO2 on till the end, but the fact that it was drifting down could reflect futility, that the patient's not responding. But I would also want to make sure it didn't reflect poor quality CPR. But in this case, the best CPR was sort of in that middle, in the green area. And even still, the CO2 is dropping, which suggests this patient's probably not going to respond. Now, on the Zoll software, you also get a summary, but I have not found that to be as helpful as what I showed you on the previous screen. Identifying the individual epics or patterns seems to be more useful, especially since it parallels the training. But there are still some things that I like to point out. I like to give them good feedback that overall the rate was right in the desired range. We don't worry about compressions that are too deep, particularly if it was a larger patient or if they were performing CPR on the gurney, which has a mattress. And so I de-emphasize the software that tells them they were too deep. But I also look at the pauses, and you see the software at the top identifies how often there were pauses that were longer than 10 seconds, much too long, as opposed to under 5 seconds, which is the blue there, which is fine if you just pause for 5 seconds to check the rhythm or to switch compressors or to deliver a shock. And then I try and give some sort of summary there at the bottom, giving them some positive things. The CPR was generally okay or good. Try not to pause for very long and use the software to help you. And here's another example of actual a case that that was provided for my EMS system, and in the section of or the epic where the rate was too fast, the recoil velocity was low, and in this case it was a pediatric case. They don't display the colored recoil velocities for pediatrics, but you can see how far down the recoil velocity fell. But I try to point out where that leads to a drop in the end tidal CO2, again, to reinforce those ideas, and then put that together on the right or underneath with the summary screen. Now, in some cases, I'll actually want to drill down onto the actual rhythm and see the case, not with 1 minute averages like you saw on the summary screen, but every single second. So when do I do that? Because that does take a little bit longer. If somebody asks me, I'm not sure what the rhythm was, can you take a look? Then I'll definitely open that file up. If the heart rate was greater than 40 in the medical record, I want to see what the rhythm was, because that's suspicious that there may have been unrecognized return of circulation. Or if the end tidal CO2 is elevated and yet they continued compressions for 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, I will go back and see if the rhythm supported that the patient actually had return of circulation. Or if the CO2 is elevated and they actually stopped resuscitative efforts, suggesting the patient was responding, but that they gave up too soon, then I want to see what the rhythm was and what the CO2 pattern was directly from the second-by-second strips. If they had ROSC and it was unrecognized and they kept doing CPR, we actually consider that to be dangerous, because there are several studies documenting that doing a compression on top of the relaxing heart is similar to R-on-T phenomenon, and that can produce ventricular fibrillation. And so again, if we see a rise in CO2 but persistent compressions, we'll often want to stop and go back and look and see if maybe they missed return of circulation. And then around the time of shocks, especially if there were long pauses, we will go and look and confirm that the rhythm was shockable, or identify that maybe they were shocking a non-shockable rhythm. And same thing if it's related to an intubation, we want to go ahead and look and see what was going on, if there was a long pause during intubation. So here's a case that I'll show you, and this is actually the feedback that was provided. This was a hospital that hadn't yet started their training with me, but we started to review cases, and there was a case who had undergone multiple defibrillations in the field and was actually transported because of persistent defib, but yet received no defibrillations in the hospital. And in fact, they only did compressions for about 10 minutes before they stopped and called the patient dead. And so we opened up the file and found that although the unfiltered ECG was hard to read, that the filtered ECG showed a shockable rhythm, and that when they stopped compressions, and this is an interesting phenomenon, that over the next 30 to 40 seconds before they turned off the defibrillator, you can see not only that it was a shockable rhythm, but it started out as a very coarse VFib, which is more shockable, and that with the stopping of compressions, that the VFib waveform became less and less shockable, even over 30 to 40 seconds, to the point where it started to move towards asystole at the bottom. So clearly an important issue that was identified only by looking at the actual files themselves and seeing second by second, or in this case, millisecond by millisecond, the rhythm, and it would display the end-tidal CO2 and show you where there were any shocks. So to summarize all of these elements, I think there are dramatic improvements. We've showed this dozens of times already, that if you change the way you train, you can actually improve outcomes fairly quickly. That the key is trying to perform perfect CPR throughout the resuscitation. That is consistently the best way to give each patient a chance of survival. That relying on BLS or ACLS is not enough, and even relying just on the new technology is not enough if you don't couple that, if you don't combine that with a change in training. And that even standard CPR parameters, even if you use your technology to achieve 5 to 6 centimeters at a rate of 100 to 120, for some patients that may not be their optimal configuration, and that we're entering an era of individualized CPR as long as you have the right guide to target, which for most of us would be end-tidal CO2. Providing feedback in real time requires that you train your leaders specifically in how to use the technology to optimize the CPR, and that means initially achieving CPR per the guidelines, secondly identifying when the compressors are starting to fatigue, and then thirdly trying to optimize or individualize the CPR and modify the targets as necessary. And then afterwards, giving them this feedback the way that I've demonstrated, hoping to change the culture and motivate people to focus on the quality of chest compressions. And with that, I will put my screen off again. I'll face up again, and then I will take whatever questions that you have.
Yes, Dr. Davis. Those are very good points, especially regarding adaptive training, personalized CPR, and grooming leadership on improving CPR performance. I have a question actually. On art, everything, most of the time it is with the help of the technology, we are improving the CPR performance. There are some facilities we do not have that technology. So with just training and grooming our leaders on CPR performance, will it give the same results without technology? With technology, I mean.
So our experience has been that if you don't have anything at all, you can still achieve EMS survival rates between 10 and 15% just by teaching a clinical assessment of quality CPR. Now, if you add end-tidal CO2, we've actually had agencies, we had the largest EMS outcomes database in the United States is the CARES database, which includes, I don't know how many, several, 50 to 100, I believe, EMS agencies from around the country. And the agency we were training actually had the best survival throughout all of CARES without having any CPR feedback, but only using end-tidal CO2 and the clinical assessment tools that we taught. But our experience especially in the hospital setting, is as you graduate from just end-tidal CO2, which would be my first priority, to then the real-time feedback. That's where you see the next big jump in survival. So the hospitals will start at 15 to 20% survival. They'll quickly get to 30 to 35% with just clinical training plus end-tidal CO2. And then they'll get to 40 to 50% once you add the CPR feedback. But again, you shouldn't feel like you're excluded until you get the technology. But I suspect that once you get a taste of this and see how easy it is, that you'll want more, and that you'll want that feedback, because it's really how you get to that upper echelon and get the best outcomes in the world. I see someone asking about ART and its relationship with the AHA and ACLS. And so it's important to distinguish between the guidelines, which are, sometimes we call them the AHA guidelines, but it's actually the ILCOR guidelines. That's an international effort that's led by scientists. And ART has had an influence on those guidelines, as has places like in Arizona that have done hands-only CPR, and there have been different approaches all around the world using different strategies. That what has happened to the guidelines is that they've become more permissive. They've allowed for 30 to 2 or continuous compressions. They've allowed for end-tidal CO2 to be used as a target. So we've been able to influence the guidelines by posting these incredible outcomes. ACLS and BLS are specific classes that are sponsored by American Heart Association. And in general, the courses, ACLS and BLS, have stayed with the traditional approach to teaching, which includes a certain way of holding your hands in a 30 to 2 for non-invasive, until something proves to be better. So even though the guidelines say you can try lots of different ways, and certain places have had good outcomes and good success by doing things differently, the training materials have stayed relatively unchanged, but that has left it open for alternative training approaches. And in fact, fewer and fewer of the EMS systems in the United States are actually relying on ACLS and BLS for training. And in fact, hospitals now are following suit. And just within the last month, the Joint Commission, which I know has a presence around the world, they offer the same kind of assessment, but they were initially the assessment program for hospitals in the United States. They have mandated that resuscitation leaders get different training than ACLS and BLS. It's okay if they get ACLS and BLS, but they have to have supplemental training, and they encourage the integration of your technology. So I think we're going to see programs like ART, which is really more of the training program, or I call it a system of care, that those are going to become more popular, whether it's ART or whether it's something like ART, as a way to achieve the ideals of the guidelines, which are trying to be less prescriptive and more setting out your overall objective. So I actually like the way things are going, and we have influenced, and I've been part of all of those processes.
That's great. That's great. I think there's another question there regarding end-tidal CO2 measured via nasal or advanced airway during CPR, and is there any difference?
So we've never looked at end-tidal CO2 measured through a nasal cannula, but each of the inline, or each of the end-tidal CO2 systems that hook up to an endotracheal tube can also be placed in between the bag and the mask. You have to check your individual adapters, but they've at this point made them so that they generally fit inside a bag and a mask. And we have data that we never published that showed that even with a single person holding the mask and squeezing the bag, which we prefer having a separate person hold the mask with 2 hands and a second person squeeze the bag. But even with just one person doing both tasks, that the end-tidal CO2 measured through a bag valve mask and then subsequently through the endotracheal tube are nearly identical. The bag valve mask underestimates the end-tidal CO2 by about 3 or 4 millimeters, which is because of the additional dead space in the system. But otherwise, is very reliable. And so rather than using nasal cannula, in most cases, you should be able to use the same adapter that you use for an endotracheal tube with your bag valve mask apparatus.
All right, thank you, doctor. I think that is our last question there. Yeah, and I think with that last question, that would end our session. Thank you, Dr. Daniel. Thank you, Dr. Daniel. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you on board with us today during for this talk. And thanks for spending your time. Art has shown a lot of positive improvements in our CPR, and hopefully it will be adapted, and we will have those trainings in our centers as well. With that, I would like to call Dr. Cairo to give
Thank
his
you. And
closing.
like I said, anybody who wants the slides, I'll make them available to Jimmy or Sean through Zoll, and we'll make sure that you can have access to those if you'd like them.
Thank you very much. That's awesome. Thank you. We're waiting for Dr. Cairo to join us.
Am I in?
Yeah, you're in.
And first and foremost, I would like to express my appreciation to Dr. Daniel for this valuable knowledge and experience sharing to our webinar over the last 1.5 hours. Through it, we will have excellently presented to us how technology and caregiver can combine together to come out with a perfect CPR. And now it is up to the people like us, the ground people, because the evidence is all on the table, for us to bring it up to our organization, so that without technology, probably not hardly, we can come up with something like what has been presented by Dr. Daniel. Again, my deepest gratitude goes to all who attended the session and helped to make it such a successful event. Thank you to Zone Malaysia for being our excellent partner. As we bring our forum to a close, we once again thank you for allowing us to be here this morning, and hope that this activity has given you a much clearer understanding of CPR. Dr. Daniel, thanks a lot for the knowledge sharing. So maybe we will have the opportunity to be together again in the same forum. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Dr. Carol. Thank you, Dr. Daniel. To the participants, there is polls going on. Can you kindly poll and to get feedbacks from y'all? It's in the polls, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. All right, you can continue poll, and thank you everyone. Have a good day.
Hello everyone, once again, thank you Dr. Cairo, Dr. Karyani, and also Dr. Daniel Davis for this awesome webinar. So before we finish the session, I would like to take this opportunity to announce another upcoming awesome webinar on the topic CPR Coach. As you may be aware, the new 2020 AHA guidelines reinforce the role and the benefits of having a CPR coach in optimizing CPR performance during an active resuscitation. So this session will be hosted by Resuscitation Council of Asia, and the speaker for this event is another superstar in the resuscitation world. Her name is Professor Elizabeth Tan, who is the Professor of Anesthesiology and Critical Care Medicine from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. So Prof. Han is the originator on the concept of a CPR coach. So this will be a very interactive webinar where you'll be able to learn about what is a CPR coach, how to create an institutional choreography in cardiac arrest events to optimize team dynamics. So don't miss it. Register now for the free event using the QR code or the link that is shown on the screen. So thank you once again for joining us. Stay safe and have a great day ahead.
ốp chịu khi mặc cho mình.
thiếu mình lấy trả và lấy siêu thị hả?
Đung đưa, đung đưa, đung đưa, đung đưa, đung đưa.
Sushi chúng chớp sushi chúng ta đi ra ngoài đi.